The winter of 1873 did not arrive the way winters usually do in the northern Rockies. Gradually, with warning, with time to prepare, it arrived like a wall. In the span of 48 hours, the temperature across the upper Montana territory plunged from a brittle 14 degrees Fahrenheit minus 10 degrees Celsius to a punishing minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit minus 39 degrees Celsius. And it held there, not for a day, not for a weekend, for 11 days straight. In the small settlement tucked along a river bend east of the Continental Divide, every chimney was working at full capacity. Men were waking before dawn not to begin their chores, but to feed fires that had burned through the night and were already hungry again. Women packed rags into wall gaps and stuffed animal hides against door frames. Children slept fully dressed, pulled close to whatever heat remained near the hearth. Firewood stacks that were supposed to last through March were disappearing by the cord. Every cabin in that settlement was fighting the cold, every cabin except one. Pressed into the narrow corridor between two granite outcroppings on the western edge of the settlement, a small but unusually solid structure sat quiet in the storm. Its chimney gave off a thin, steady thread of smoke, not the desperate, billowing exhaust of fire burning itself out trying to hold a room. A thin thread, controlled, unhurried, and inside, according to every account that has survived from that season, whether through a short entry in a supply ledger, a letter written in early February, or the oral record passed down through at least two families in the region, the temperature never dropped below 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 14 degrees Celsius. Not once. Not during the worst 11 days the settlement had ever endured. The man who built that cabin was a stonemason from the Scottish Highlands named Euan Reed. He had arrived in the territory 2 years earlier with a mule, a set of iron tools, and a habit of staring at rock faces for long stretches of time that made his neighbors deeply uncomfortable. They had laughed at the way he built. They stopped laughing in January. To understand what Euan Reed did, and why no one else had thought to do it, you need to understand the world he arrived in. The northern Montana territory in the early 1870s was not a place that forgave carelessness. The elevation along the eastern slope of the Continental Divide ranged between 4,500 and 6,000 feet, roughly 1,370 to 1,830 meters, high enough that summer never fully settled before autumn began pulling it back. The growing season lasted perhaps 90 days in a good year. The prevailing winds came out of the northwest, cold, direct, and relentless, funneled by the mountain terrain into something closer to a blade than a breeze. Average winter temperatures in the region hover between 5 degrees Fahrenheit and 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 15 degrees Celsius to minus 6 degrees Celsius, on ordinary nights, during the periodic cold snaps that swept down from the Canadian plains. What the Blackfoot and Crow peoples who knew this land far longer than any settler called by names that roughly translated to the sky pressing down. Temperatures could drop to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 34 degrees Celsius, or lower, and hold for days without a break in the clouds. Timber was available, but not unlimited. The lower valley floors where settlements tended to form were often covered in cottonwood and aspen, fast-burning, low-density wood that drew good heat but consumed quickly. The higher elevation conifer stands offered better fuel, but getting logs down the slopes in winter required effort that could itself become dangerous. Local accounts from the era suggest that a typical family of four in a standard single-room log cabin burned between 5 and 7 cords of wood between October and March, roughly 640 to 896 cubic feet, 18 to 25 cubic meters, of split and stacked timber. That was the baseline. That was what survival looked like before Euan Reed started staring at those rock faces. Standard cabin construction in the region followed a logic that was pragmatic and largely inherited from Eastern and Midwestern building traditions that had evolved in entirely different climates. A rectangular floor plan, single-thickness log walls, a stone or clay-lined fireplace centered on one of the short walls, a steeply pitched roof to shed snow, and a door positioned on the south or east face to catch morning light. It was a system that worked, after a fashion. It kept people alive. But it was relentlessly inefficient, and everyone who lived inside one knew it. Heat radiated out through the walls nearly as fast as a fireplace could produce it. Corners stayed cold. Floors stayed colder. The air near the ceiling, where no one slept, was often 30 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 17 to 22 degrees Celsius, warmer than the air near the ground. where everyone did. Nobody questioned it. It was simply the cost of being alive in that place at that time. Euan Reed questioned it from the first week he arrived. By the time Euan Reed reached the settlement in the spring of 1871, the community had already been through 3 winters in that location. 3 winters of burning through wood. 3 winters of waking up to a thin film of ice on the water bucket, left 6 feet from the fire. 3 winters of watching the oldest and the youngest members of each household suffer most. Not dramatically, not in ways that made it into official records, but in the quiet, grinding accumulation of cold that wore bodies down and shortened the distance between a bad cough and something much worse. The cabins themselves were not badly built by the standards of the era. The men who constructed them had experience. They had notched corners tight, chinked gaps with a mixture of clay, animal hair, and dry grass, and in 2 cases had managed to haul enough flat stone up from the riverbank to construct proper raised hearths. But the physics of single-wall log construction worked against them in ways that no amount of skill or effort could fully overcome. A standard log wall of the period, green or partially seasoned pine or fir, roughly 8 to 10 inches, 20 to 25 centimeters in diameter, had an effective insulating value somewhere in the range of R8 to R11 by modern calculation. For comparison, contemporary building codes in cold climate regions typically require wall assemblies with R values of R20 or higher. The settlers were not operating at half efficiency. They were operating at less than half of what we now know is the minimum for comfortable cold weather habitation. The fire had to compensate for everything the walls failed to do, and fire is a hungry, indiscriminate machine. It does not heat rooms evenly. It heats the air immediately around it and sends a heated air rising toward the ceiling, where it presses against the roof and escapes through every gap and crack it can find, while cold air sinks along the walls and pools across the floor. The family cat, the boots, the water bucket, the sleeping children, all of them lived in the cold zone. The ceiling and the chimney lived in warmth that served no one. On a minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 29 degrees Celsius night, a competent fire in a standard frontier hearth might hold the center of a single-room cabin at somewhere between 45 degrees Fahrenheit and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees Celsius to 13 degrees Celsius, while burning through a quarter wood in under 10 hours. By 3 in the morning, whoever was lightest sleeper would be adding logs again. By 5, the fire would need rebuilding from near scratch. This was the rhythm of winter. Wake, feed the fire, keep people alive, sleep briefly, wake again. 3 winters of it had made the community efficient at the routine. It had also made them very tired, and entirely convinced that this was simply the nature of the problem. Unsolvable, permanent. The price of living where they had chosen to live. Euan Reed was not yet convinced of that. He had a habit that his neighbors found strange, and that his nearest neighbor, a Missouri-born farmer named Garrett Hollis, described in a letter to his brother as watching rocks the way a preacher watches sinners, like he expected them to do something any minute. What Euan was watching, specifically, were the 2 granite outcroppings on the western edge of the settlement. They were not dramatic formations, no towering cliffs, no cathedral spires of stone. They were low, broad shoulders of exposed bedrock, each perhaps 30 to 40 feet, 9 to 12 meters, high and running roughly north to south for 60 to 80 feet, 18 to 24 meters. Between them, a natural corridor perhaps 25 to 30 feet, 7.5 to 9 meters, of relatively flat ground. The other settlers had looked at that corridor and seen a useless slot of land, too narrow for a proper homestead, too rocky underfoot for a garden. Euan looked at it through a different set of eyes. The eyes, specifically, of a man who had grown up building and repairing dry stone walls in Perthshire, Scotland, a trade that required an intimate understanding of how stone absorbed, retained, and released energy. In the Highlands, stonemasons learned early that certain walls stayed dry on the inside during rain not because of their thickness, but because of their orientation and their ability to absorb moisture before it could pass through. The same principle Euan understood applied to heat. He began spending time in that corridor at different hours of the day. He noticed that the southern exposure of the rock faces, the sides that caught the low winter sun, were measurably warmer to the touch in the afternoon than any exposed surface elsewhere in the settlement. On a day when the air temperature sat at 10 degrees Fahrenheit minus 12 degrees Celsius, the south-facing granite was closer to 4 degrees Fahrenheit 4 degrees Celsius at its surface by 2 in the afternoon. He noticed that the corridor between the two faces was noticeably calmer. The northwestern wind, which hammered every other structure in the settlement, was deflected upward and around by the stone before it reached that narrow gap. And he noticed, this was a detail that would define everything, that even on clear, cold nights, the ground temperature inside that corridor remained several degrees higher than the open ground around it. The stone was releasing what it had stored during the day, slowly, quietly, for hours after dark. He was not looking at a building site. He was looking at a heat engine that had been running, unnoticed, since before the first settler arrived. In the spring of 1871, Euan Reed staked his claim on that corridor and began to plan. He did not simply build near the rock faces. That was the first thing Garrett Hollis got wrong when he described the project to anyone who would listen that summer, and he described it to many people. Reed's putting his cabin between the rocks, Hollis would say, as though proximity alone explained the idea, and by explaining it, exposed its foolishness. What Euan was doing was more precise and more deliberate than that. He was integrating the rock faces into the thermal system of the building itself. The foundation came first, and it was unlike any foundation the settlement had seen. Rather than clearing the corridor floor and building on top of it, Euan spent 3 weeks excavating down 18 inches, 46 centimeters, below grade along the 2 long walls of his planned cabin footprint, following the natural line of the bedrock outcroppings. Where the granite came close to the surface, he did not fight it. He used it. He mortared flat-laid river stones directly against the base of each rock face, creating a thermal connection between his floor system and the living bedrock itself. The floor of Euan's cabin would not be sitting on soil that froze from the top down in November and stayed frozen until April. His floor would be in thermal contact with several thousand tons of granite that had never, in any recorded winter, frozen solid at depth. The cabin walls were next. On the 2 short ends, the north and south faces of the structure, he built conventional log walls, notched and chinked in the standard way. But on the 2 long sides, east and west, where the granite outcroppings ran parallel to his building, he did something no one in the settlement had attempted. He built a composite wall, an inner log wall of standard diameter, then an 8-inch 20-centimeter, gap-packed with dry moss and with shavings, and finally an outer facing of flat-laid stone mortared directly against the rock face. The stone facing was not decorative. It was thermal mass, a deliberate reservoir heat that would absorb warmth during the day and release it through the night, buffering the interior against the swings and outside temperature that made conventional cabins so difficult to heat. The chimney placement raised the most eyebrows. Rather than centering on the north wall, the standard location, chosen put the fire in the middle of the room and the smoke exit as far from prevailing wind as possible. Euan positioned his hearth against the eastern interior log wall, with the flue running up to a stone mast that he built out from the wall by 14 inches, 35 centimeters, into the room. The firebox itself was modest in size, roughly 18 by 24 inches, 46 by 61 centimeters, at the opening. But the stone mass surrounding it extended 6 feet, 1.8 meters, up the wall before transitioning to the clay-lined flue. That mass, local accounts suggest, it weighed somewhere between 3,500 and 4,500 pounds, 1,590 to 2,040 kilograms of sandstone and river granite, was not just a chimney. It was a heat battery. Every fire Euan built would charge it, and for hours after the fire burned down, it would discharge that stored heat slowly and evenly into the room. By late September of 1871, the shell of the cabin was complete. The roof was steeply pitched, framed with green-cut pine and covered with split shakes, with an overhang deep enough on the south face to block the high summer sun, but admit the low winter sun directly through the 2 south-facing windows, each glazed with scraped translucent hide stretched over a wooden frame. Garrett Hollis looked at the finished structure and shook his head. "You've gone all that trouble," he said, "and your fire's going to be cold before midnight." Euan Reed did not argue. He invited his neighbor to come back in January. The autumn of 1871 arrived early in the Montana Territory. By the first week of October, the cottonwoods along the river had already gone yellow, and the first snow, thin, dry, unconvincing, had dusted the higher slopes to the west. The settlement was doing what frontier settlements always did at that time of year: stacking wood, checking roof seams, rechinkling gaps that had opened during the dry summer months, mentally accounting for every resource that would need to stretch across the next 5 months, and talking about Euan Reed's cabin. The conversation had started in late summer, when the composite walls began to take shape and the unusual chimney mass grew visible above the roofline. It had stayed polite through August. By September, as the structure neared completion, it had become something sharper. The particular kind of community skepticism that forms when someone does something visibly different from everyone else, and the difference cannot be immediately explained away. Garrett Hollis was not the only skeptic, but he was the most vocal. He had built 2 cabins in his life, one in Missouri before the war and one here, and he understood log construction the way men of his generation understood most practical things, through accumulated experience, tested over time, passed down in the form of rules that had survived because they worked. "You don't put your fire on the side wall," he told anyone who would listen. "Center fire, center heat. That's how you keep a room." The stone mass around Euan's hearth, in Hollis's view, was nothing but an obstacle, a thing that would absorb the fire's warmth before it could reach the people in the room, a heat sink dressed up as a heat source. He was not entirely wrong about the short term. A conventional open-face fireplace radiates heat into a room immediately and aggressively, flooding the space closest to it with warmth within minutes of lighting. Euan's enclosed firebox and heavy stone surround would take longer to warm, perhaps 2 to 3 hours from a cold start before the stone mass reached the temperature at which it began to radiate back into the room significantly. In the first hour of a fire, Euan's cabin would feel colder than a standard one. Hollis had visited once during a test fire in late September and walked away satisfied that his assessment was correct. "Stone drinks heat," he said afterward. "That Scotsman is feeding the walls and freezing himself." The settlement's most experienced builder, a Vermont-born carpenter named Adlai Pruitt, who had been constructing log structures since before the war and had spent time in Minnesota studying how Scandinavian immigrants framed their homes, offered a more technical objection. The corridor position concerned him. Cold air, he argued, was denser than warm air and had a tendency to pool in low, sheltered spaces on clear, still nights. A cabin pressed between 2 rock faces in a narrow corridor might find itself sitting in a natural cold sink, a bowl of settled Arctic air that formed when the wind died and radiation cooling stripped heat from the ground surface. In that scenario, the same topographic shelter that blocked the wind could trap the coldest air of the night directly around the structure. It was a genuine concern, and Pruitt raised it without cruelty. He had seen cold sinks wreck a garden in Minnesota and had heard of livestock lost to them. He told Euan directly, in the respectful tone of one craftsman speaking to another, that he thought the site selection was a fundamental error, that all the stone mass in the world would not compensate for a cabin that sat in pool cold air every clear night of the winter. Euan listened to both men carefully. He thanked Pruitt for concern. He told Hollis he hoped to have him for coffee in February. He finished his cabin and moved in before the first real snow fell in mid-October. The settlement watched and waited and kept stacking firewood it expected to need. The cold snap arrived in the second week of January 1873. Not 1871, the year Euan built, but the second full winter he spent in the structure. That distinction matters. The first winter had been severe enough to generate comment, with local oral accounts suggesting the cabin performed noticeably better than its neighbors in terms of consumption and interior comfort. But the winter of 1873 was the one that settled the question permanently, because it was the one that pushed every other structure in the settlement past its design limits. On January 11th, the temperature dropped to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 39 degrees Celsius before dawn, and did not climb above minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 29 degrees Celsius for 11 consecutive days. The wind out of the northwest, which normally averaged 12 to 15 miles per hour, 19 to 24 kilometers per hour, in January, gusted between 30 and 40 miles per hour, 48 to 64 kilometers per hour, during the first 4 days of the cold snap, driving the effective wind chill temperature to values that local accounts describe only as beyond reckoning. The Settlement 7 standard cabins responded the way standard cabins do when pushed past their margin. They burned wood at a rate that began to alarm their occupants by the third day. Two of the structures, a slightly smaller cabin on the northern edge of the settlement and a dugout-style half cabin that had been built into a hillside the previous spring, dropped to interior temperatures of 38 degrees Fahrenheit to 42 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 degrees Celsius to 6 degrees Celsius, during the coldest nights despite fires burning continuously. Adlai Pruitt's cabin, the best-built conventional structure in the settlement, held 50 degrees Fahrenheit to 54 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius to 12 degrees Celsius, at chest height through most of the event, but Pruitt later recorded that he burned through nearly a full core wood, roughly 128 cubic feet, 3.6 cubic meters, of split timber, in 8 days. At that rate, a winter-long supply of 6 cords would have been exhausted well before March. On the 5th day, Garrett Hollis sent his wife and youngest child to stay with the Pruitt family. His cabin, which had always run cold in the corner opposite the fireplace, was showing interior temperatures below 40 degrees Fahrenheit 4 degrees Celsius in that quadrant regardless of how hard he burned. Euan Reed burned approximately 2/3 of a cord across the entire 11-day event. His interior temperature, measured by the simple expedient of hanging a spirit thermometer at mid-wall height in the center of the single main room, did not drop below 58 degrees Fahrenheit 14 degrees Celsius at any point. During the afternoons of the days when the sun was able to clear the horizon long enough to strike the south-facing stone, it climbed as high as 67 degrees Fahrenheit, 19 degrees Celsius. At 3 in the morning, the coldest point of the diurnal cycle, the hour when other cabins were at their most vulnerable, Euan's stone mass was still radiating heat stored from the fire he had banked 6 hours earlier, holding the room at 60 degrees Fahrenheit to 62 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 degrees Celsius to 17 degrees Celsius, without any active combustion at all. The physics behind it were not mysterious, though they were invisible, which is perhaps why they had gone unnoticed. The granite outcroppings flanking the cabin had spent the autumn and early winter absorbing heat during the daylight hours and surrendering it slowly through the nights, a thermal flywheel effect that kept the immediate environment around the cabin several degrees warmer than the open ground of the settlement. Pruitt's cold sink concern had not materialized, because the rock faces were tall and oriented in a way that prevented the stillest cold air from pooling at cabin level. The corridor shape actually created a slight upward convective draft on clear nights as warmer air rose from the stone surfaces, drawing colder air up and away from the ground. The composite walls, with their inner log face, insulating moss and shavings gap, and outer stone mass connected to the living bedrock, lost heat at roughly half the rate of a single log wall. And the interior stone chimney mass, those 3,500 to 4,500 pounds, 1,590 to 2,040 kilograms of sandstone and granite, continued to emit radiant heat for 6 to 8 hours after a fire burned down the coals, functioning as a slow-release thermal battery that smoothed out the brutal temperature spikes and drops that made sleeping in a conventional frontier cabin such a physiologically stressful experience. On the 8th day of the cold snap, Adlai Pruitt walked over to Euan Reed's cabin in the mid-afternoon and stood at the door for a long moment after Euan opened it. He was not coming to borrow anything. He was there to feel the air. He stood in the doorway, his breath clouding in the space between inside and outside, and he looked at the spirit thermometer hanging on the wall behind Euan's shoulder. Then he looked at the thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney. Not the desperate, exhausting column of a fire fighting for its life, but a thin, even thread of combustion products from a banked fire doing the minimum necessary, because the stone was doing the rest. "I owe you an apology," Pruitt said. Euan handed him a cup of coffee. It was hot. The technique did not spread overnight. Frontier knowledge rarely does. It moves the way heat moves through stone, slowly, steadily, without announcement, until you realize that the temperature in the room has changed and you cannot point to the exact moment it happened. By the winter of 1874, Adlai Pruitt had incorporated the stone chimney mass principle into a new cabin he was building for a family that arrived from Ohio that summer. He did not replicate Euan's design exactly. He could not, because no other site in the settlement had the same granite corridor, but he built the interior chimney mass at twice the volume of anything he had attempted before, using flat-cut sandstone hauled from the riverbank, and he oriented the firebox to radiate into the longest axis of the room rather than the widest. The family that moved in that October reported burning measurably less wood through their first winter than neighbors' incomparable structures. By 1876, 3 additional structures in the region had been deliberately sited against or near exposed rock faces, with varying degrees of intentionality and varying results. Oral accounts from the area, gathered by a territorial surveyor named Clement Oakes, who passed through in 1877 and had an interest in vernacular building methods, suggest that the principle had begun to be discussed in terms that approximated its actual physics. The idea that stone stored heat, that stored heat was almost as valuable as produced heat, and that the goal of a good winter cabin was not merely to generate warmth, but to hold it. Euan Reed himself remained in the territory through at least the early 1880s. Whether he built other structures incorporating his methods is not definitively documented. What is documented? In Oakes' survey notes, in a handful of surviving letters, and in the memory of at least one family that traced its connection to the settlement through 3 generations, is that his cabin remained in use for more than 2 decades after construction, that it never required the kind of emergency structural repair that claimed most log buildings within 10 to 15 years, and that it was consistently described by everyone who spent time in it during winter as the warmest house in the valley. That phrase deserves a moment of consideration. Not the warmest because it had the biggest fire, not the warmest because it had the most wood stacked against the wall. The warmest because the man who built it understood something that the more experienced builders around him had not thought to ask, that a building is not just a container for heat, but a participant in producing and retaining it, that the ground beneath your feet and the stone beside your wall are not passive bystanders in your fight against the cold. They are thermal partners, if you know how to engage them. Euan Reed knew how. He had grown up in a country where the stone itself seemed alive with a memory of past warmth, where a stonemason learned to feel the temperature of a wall before he touched it, where the relationship between rock and heat was not abstract physics, but daily. Physical knowledge passed from hand to hand across generations. He brought that knowledge across the Atlantic and into the northern Rockies, and in the winter of 1873, it kept his family warm while his neighbors burned through their last reserves and counted the days until the cold broke. The cold always breaks. The question the frontier asked, the question it asks anyone who lives close enough to the edge to feel it, is whether your walls will last long enough to see it happen. Euan Reed's did, and the reason they did is not lost to history. It is sitting in the physics of thermal mass and passive solar positioning, available to anyone willing to look at a rock face and ask what has been quietly doing all this time. What other solutions like this one are still out there, waiting in the landscape to be noticed? If you've made it this far, you already have the instinct to find them. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. And if you know of a traditional building technique from your region that the modern world has forgotten, tell us about it. That's the next story. And there are many more where this one came from. Educational disclaimer. This video features frontier-inspired narratives created for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, personal stories, names, and specific situations portrayed are fictional reconstructions. However, many of the building methods, survival concepts, and practical ideas discussed are inspired by real historical techniques, traditional practices, and basic physical principles used in past frontier environments. Any modern use of these ideas should be carefully evaluated according to current safety standards, building codes, regulations, and professional guidance. This content is intended for educational and historical interest only and should not be considered professional, technical, or legal advice.